Thanks so much for giving me the time to present to you today. What I really want to do, as has been said, is focus on peer-to-peer exploitation and abuse. And what I'll do is present you with some of the data and research that we have available on the issue at the moment, and then share with you a case file example, which is one of the 9 cases I'm currently reviewing as part of my doctoral research into peer-on-peer abuse. And I focus on children in the cases who went into foster care following an abusive incident, just for us to really think about what role foster carers would play there in responding to the issues those young people face. And then I'll give you some kind of the emerging themes really in the analysis I'm running at the moment, just for us to think about, and the type of responses that we're trying to build to this based on that research in local areas, and finish with a few questions really that I don't have necessarily strong answers to, but in terms of the role of foster carers in actually being able to be part of that response that we're trying to build in local sites. So outside of the work I'm doing at the university, we already know from research, particularly that done by NSPCC and Christine Barter at the University of Bristol, that 1 in 3 girls would have experienced sexual violence from a partner before they turn 18. So in terms of statistics, it's unfortunately more commonplace than we would like to believe. And we know anyway, when we look at adults' reports of their experiences of contact child sexual abuse, that when adults, and the most recent one was the Radical Control Survey in 2011, reported that they had been sexually abused, 2/3 of those adults reported that the abuse was perpetrated by another young person and not by an adult. It's just that we tend to forget that when we talk about child sexual abuse more generally, but the statistics have been there for a number of years and have been reinforced with more recent work on sexual exploitation more specifically. So in 2011, Bernardo's reported that 1/4 of their sexual exploitation service users were being exploited by peers and not by adults. And as Sue's already pointed out, the Office of the Children's Commissioner's inquiry identified that 29% of perpetrators who have been identified by professionals were under 19 and the youngest was 12. And most recently, the Pan-London survey of responses to sexual exploitation that was led by myself and Helen Beckett here in the university and worked on with other colleagues. Peer-on-peer exploitation was the most frequently identified form of abuse by safeguarding boards across London. So we know that it's an issue affecting young people, and I would say around the country, because the project I'm running at the moment received 40 applications from local authorities around England for support to address peer-on-peer abuse, and we had space to work with 3. So we know that this isn't a London-specific issue. This was being raised to me by young people when I was running research on the impact of gang association on women and girls at the charity Race on the Agenda, which I worked at from 2006 to 2011. And these are the way that young women back then were talking about this issue. The young woman at the top was talking about her partner. If you make an enemy of him, you make an enemy of all of them. And this is really important and something I think, I probably didn't hear that properly, to be honest. It's in my report, I didn't really hear that until I started to run the case files, because the issue of bystanders and the peer network is probably the most significant emerging theme coming out of my analysis. And our worry is not just about the young people who are identified as victims and perpetrators, it's all of the other young people who sit around that relationship and who get involved in sustaining and facilitating power imbalances and abuse. And that's exactly what this young person was saying. She was more concerned about how all of his friends would treat her in addition to the risk that that particular partner posed. This young woman talking about her friends. Sometimes the people that you chill with want you to do certain things that you don't want to do, but you have to do it because you're part of the crew, you're part of it. And I use this quote because this young woman was talking about her friends. And very often we think about exploitation and abuse as being something that takes place within more traditional type relationships, with people referencing boyfriends and girlfriends and us trying to work out whether that's a healthy relationship or not. Actually, in peer-on-peer cases, the vast majority of the ones I'm looking at the moment and have come up against have been friendship groups. And sexual violence is part of that friendship group and really is an extension of sexual bullying. So it's very important not just to be thinking about, is that child in a healthy relationship, but what is their friendship group like? Who are their peers? And could there be sexual violence in that context? And this young woman who I met in custody...
I can't take any requests at the moment.
It's okay. Saying, I'll tell the nurses and like my counsellor about the domestic violence and that, but I won't tell them about the rest of it because they can tell other people and they won't understand. They'll think, oh, she deserved it, she's a criminal. And this, once again, is commonplace in a number of the case files with young women who are in sexually violent and exposed to peer groups being drawn into offending and violent behaviour. So they feel that they have then become a criminal and are therefore not viable as a victim. And what we find is the way that we structure our services is that we have victim services and we have perpetrator services. And for these young women, they feel like if they're in a victim service, they can't actually disclose the context of their abuse because that would then make them a perpetrator and therefore they can no longer be in the victim service. And only recently I had a call from a refuge who was struggling to accommodate an adult woman because she was a perpetrator of violence as well as a victim of violence and therefore wasn't safe to be placed in the refuge. And young men who I interviewed for the same research project, talking about their attitudes towards gender identity and relationships. This young man at the top was 13 years old. People want to be seen as like the alpha male, like the rude boy, the bad boy. They'll be scared of him. They want to be the biggest, the best. This was his driving force. This was his focus. And this is also why he hit his girlfriend when she disrespected him in front of the peer group, because that was going to work against this, and that is what he was driving towards. And this is another young man talking about his first sexual encounter. Imagine if you've got a couple of them in the crew that they're virgins, yeah? It's a big thing the first time you have sex with a girl and someone laid it on for you. Now, for young men in this setup, particularly street gangs, but not exclusively, young women will be provided. Now, what that actually means is it's not as organised as it sounds. One girl will be being abused and a message goes out to say, we've got a girl in this venue or in this park or in this block of flats, come down. And she has now been provided, laid on, and boys arrive. I feel like this is actually quite a treat. Not actually conceptualising anything as rape or sexual violence. And one of the cases I'm reviewing at the moment, that is exactly what happened. And while the initial attack on the victim was a punishment by one young man, he then called out a lot of other young people who approached the young woman and assaulted her. And they had no idea about the punishment. What they were focused on was this girl being provided and going to make assumptions about her now consenting. So there were dual motives at play, and very much their motive was, as this young man mentioned. So what does this look like in case examples? Well, these are two young women who form part of a wider victim pool in one case that I'm looking at the moment that had multiple victims, Sharon and Cecile, girls aged 11 years old at the time the abuse started, and then the transition to secondary school seems to be particularly important for children who are being exploited by their peers and friends because everyone tries to fit in the first term of their first year, and during that fitting in process some will be bullied, and this is exactly what happened with Sharon and Cecile, and that bullying then extended to sexual assaults. Both are part of a violent peer group within the school, mainly boys who were 13 to 14, but there were a number of young women associated with that peer group. Their experiences of rape and exploitation were sometimes different. In Sharon's case, she saw it as that's what you did to be friends with these people, and she wanted to be their friend and she wanted to belong to the friendship group. She also had her mobile phone stolen a lot and would be told she could get it back if she performed sexual acts on the young men who had taken her phone. In Cecile's case, what you'll see with Sharon is, at the very bottom, she had a history of child sexual abuse. Indeed, she'd been sexually abused from infancy. And so, when the exploitation started, she needed very little in the way of physical violence as a form of coercion. In fact, she was very compliant. This was different to Cecile, who didn't have that history of child sexual abuse, so actually experienced a lot more physical violence and would engage in sexual activity in exchange for perceived sense of safety. So it was to avoid being hit again. So there was different tactics used by the group to gain sexual acts. Both of them became involved in violence. In Sharon's case, she was convicted of a robbery offence. In Cecile's case, she was accused of bullying and excluded from school as a result of that before the exploitation was actually identified. Following disclosures, both young women were physically assaulted in school by girls and boys within the school context who were trying to make them withdraw their allegations, and the boys had set this up. Sharon remained in school, whereas Cecile had been permanently excluded. Both were placed in foster care after the abuse was identified. So while Sharon had a history of child sexual abuse, she was actually living with another relative at the point at which the exploitation was identified. Cecile was living with her mother. She had a history of domestic violence in the home, but her father hadn't been living there from the age of 3. so she was living with her mother, and both had siblings. Both were removed from those homes, placed out of the area for their own safety, and placed into foster care. And indeed, in both cases, the carers said that they couldn't cope with the children anymore, that they were running, they were leaving the house, that they could not keep them safe. And so a decision was made, in Sean's case, after 10 months, to place them both in foster care. So this is what would have happened to them when they arrived with the foster carers. In terms of young men, Louis was one of 10 suspects in another case that I'm looking at. In fact, it was the case where the boys arrived at the venue and sexually assaulted a young woman. He was the lead perpetrator and initiated it, having set it up as a punishment for this young woman. Now, Louis was 13 when this happened. Once again, he was part of a violent peer group. He'd been a victim of robbery when he was 9 years old, and that led him to become part of a local street gang. He saw his cousin being murdered when he was 12, and then had begun using sexual and physical violence within the school context, none of which was being referred on to children's social care, was being held within the school environment. He is recorded as using pornography, and indeed it's found on his phone after his arrest. He had already been excluded from school when he was 13. He was a repeat missing young person, and in fact had been locked out of the house by his mother, who said that he was using violence against her and that she could no longer control him, so he used to sleep in the garden. And this was the point at which he was placed into foster care 2 weeks before the sexual assault took place. He rang the police himself and was taken into police protection because he couldn't get into the house, and was placed in foster care. So once again, a different trajectory, but all of these children were in foster care during a police investigation and following kind of court case in peer-on-peer abuse. One of the things that really crops up for people like Louis, young men like Louis in particular, is questions around culpability and the impact of group dynamics on young women, but particularly on boys and young men who are perpetrating acts of peer exploitation and abuse. The biggest disjunct that we have in policy terms is between the age of consent and the minimum age of criminal responsibility. The age of consent, as we know, is 16. The minimum age of criminal responsibility is 10, which means that for boys like Louis, who are 13 years old, they're below the age of consent to sexual activity, but above the age of criminal responsibility. So they can be criminally responsible for a sexual act that they can't consent to based on the age of consent to sexual activity. And this mismatch really creates barriers for professionals in trying to understand to what extent did Louis understand what he was doing and to what extent is he culpable. Because if we place that sexual act within a consensual relationship, we would question his understanding. When we place it in a criminal justice context, we hold him fully responsible. And this disjunct is even more complicated when we're talking about young people who are offending in groups. And when we look into research into multiple perpetrator rape more broadly, we know that the younger you are, you're more likely to commit a sexual offence in a group than you are on your own. The older you get, the more likely you are to commit it on your own and not in a group. So the vast majority of group-based sexual assaults are perpetrated by young people under the age of 25, and a big chunk of them by young people under the age of 18. And that is very much because the group dynamic is really important. And what we see in the summing up of these cases is the judge is saying you would never have committed this act if you were on your own. We see that some young men in the group very much would have committed that act on their own, and in fact were displaying sexually harmful behaviour, particularly in schools, in the years leading up to the offence in question. Other young men were not committing any acts of sexually harmful behaviour, but once they were part of this violent peer group, began engaging in sexual violence. And the dynamic of the group will then have an impact on how powerful a young man feels, and therefore his sense of agency. So if you have 10 young men, as was in Louis' case, or assaulting a young woman, compared to that young woman, that group of young men had a lot of power. But each individual young man in the group will have their own experience and sense of power, and some will feel like they want to say no to the group and are unable to do that, and some will feel very much like they're controlling the behaviour of the whole group. And these differing understandings of power are not unpicked generally in the way that we respond to the group, which is to respond to them as a whole and to treat them very much the same once an offence has been committed. And indeed, in Louis's case, a young man did say no to the group and remove the victim from the assault. And as a consequence of that, he had to be removed from the local area permanently for his own safety. So that was the consequence of making a different choice in that type of group. So what are some of the emerging themes from the case file analysis more generally? Well, there seems to be a real difficulty amongst a number of professionals in really understanding what significant harm means when everyone involved is a child. We find children being assessed as low risk if they've been missing overnight with their partner because the partner's the same age as them and therefore they're just acting out as teenagers, whereas if they've been missing overnight with someone in their 30s, we'd be considering them high risk. So assumptions being made based on the age of everyone involved that the risk is somehow reduced, and so statements like is not at any immediate risk repeatedly coming up in the files, even though that young person has already disclosed sexual violence. We also find that the risk assessments that are being used are very static, they're not dynamic at all, and the young people's experiences are very much dynamic. So in the morning, they might be low risk, but then on the way to school, there's been a fight, and by the time they get to school, they're now at high risk of a sexual assault in the school environment because of what happened on the bus. And the risk assessment that was used the day before becomes irrelevant, and there's no real ability to be dynamic within the current structures to really unpick how risk is shifting, how vulnerability is shifting, and also how resilience is shifting. Because of the static approach that's being taken, we're failing to identify points of escalation, so where something moves from being low to high risk, is really the only people that seem to know that that is happening are bystanders, are other young people who are well aware of what's about to happen, but who are not telling anyone else about it. So even in a murder case file that I'm reviewing at the moment, a young woman is on the phone to her friend 10 minutes before the murder saying, you can't kill him, but she doesn't tell anyone else until after it's happened, and then she makes a disclosure to her mum that she knows who did it. So there's a real issue with actually engaging with a wider network of young people to understand what's happening, to identify points of escalation, and then to contain kind of risk after the incident, because what we find is after the disclosure, as was in the case of Sian and Cecile, other young people who weren't involved in the assault get involved in trying to coerce and intimidate the victim. And that means that containment of the peer network becomes quite difficult. So in one case, 2 young people are given harassment notices for contacting the victim who had nothing to do with the original assault. And then a 3rd young person contacts the victim over the internet, and there's a discussion about, well, how are we going to contain this now, because we can't put a harassment order on an entire secondary school, so what's our other option? Well, the option that we're talking about in the centre at the moment is thinking about how you build a response that extends beyond the home environment. What you find is that our assessments and interventions are very much levelled at the child and the home, which is why we see movement of children, and why Sian, Cecile, and indeed Louis were all moved from the home into foster care. The problem that you have when you're receiving children into foster care who are like Sian, Cecile and Louis is some of them will have had experiences of abuse and have experienced risk in the home, but actually the presenting risk in terms of peer exploitation sits outside of the home environment. And because professionals and others struggle to change what's happening in these environments, we simply just move everyone out of that environment. It's very expensive, and with the internet, it's pretty problematic because this is everywhere, no matter where the home is. And young people's experiences of power, gender, harm are happening in these spaces, but our intervention is always coming in at this level, which is very challenging for people who are then trying to care for children. We also have this disjunct in terms of child protection, where we're in these cases talking about vulnerable adolescents, and in general the system works much better for vulnerable children, particularly those under 5, although we still know there are problems. We're talking about risk outside of the home and not risk within it in the main, in terms of the exploitation that's happening. We're talking about abuse by other young people and not abuse by adults. And we're talking about unsafe social spaces rather than an unsafe individual that we just have to isolate and remove from where that child is. So to sum up, some questions based on that really that I have and was thinking about in coming here today is given how much movement is being used at the moment to manage peer exploitation, it means that the role of foster carers are pretty essential, because what we find is a number of these children, the families will not move with them. And so children are being placed into foster care for that reason. It's therefore important to really be able to understand young people's social environments, the ones they've left, as well as their home. It's not just getting a sense of the child that you're receiving, what was the home life like, it's what was happening in school, what was happening in the peer group, what was happening in the neighbourhood, because actually that's where the harm was. What are the social environments that the young people who are in your care, what are they like now, the ones they're navigating, and how engaged are you in them? How much do you know about the peer group, about the school, and about other social spaces? And how do you create a safe space in the home that can counter external risks? It's quite a challenge. And how do we all contribute really to creating safe external spaces for young people in our care? Because we can't just assume that a safe home will mean safety in cases of peer-on-peer exploitation. So then my contact details. I'm sorry it's been a bit of a whirlwind, but I hope you